There is a quiet moment many men experience when the noise of dating fades and the room finally goes still. It often arrives late at night, not with bitterness, but with clarity. You realize you are older now, still single, and strangely, calmer. The urgency is gone. The chase no longer grips your chest, and in that silence, an understanding about women begins to surface, one you could never hear when you were younger. When a man is young, he tends to believe attraction is something he must earn through effort, performance, or persistence. He mistakes intensity for depth. He believes desire is logical, that if he does the right things, says the right words, or proves his worth loudly enough, love will eventually comply. This belief is not foolish, it is human. It is the mind searching for control in an emotional world that does not obey rules. But time has a way of softening illusions. An older single man has usually loved deeply, lost painfully, and watched patterns repeat themselves despite his best intentions. He has seen relationships begin with fireworks and end in quiet disappointment. He has been both desired and dismissed, sometimes by the same woman, without fully understanding why. And slowly, a realization forms. Attraction was never about effort alone. It was about emotional positioning. What he begins to understand is that women, like men, respond less to words and more to emotional states. They feel before they analyze. They sense stability before they admire ambition. When a man is internally restless, seeking validation, fearing abandonment, or chasing outcomes, this unease is subtly transmitted, not consciously noticed, but felt. And feelings, not logic, guide attraction. With age comes a sharper perception of this truth. An older single man starts to see that women are not drawn to certainty in plans, but to certainty in presence. Not to control, but to composure. Not to need, but to grounded self-sufficiency. He notices that when he stops trying to impress, conversations change. When he stops rushing intimacy, connection either deepens naturally or dissolves cleanly, without drama. This is not cynicism. It is emotional literacy. He understands now that many conflicts he once blamed on incompatibility were actually mismatches in emotional maturity or timing. He sees how attraction can exist without readiness, how affection can fade without betrayal, and how interest can disappear simply because emotional polarity was lost. Most importantly, he stops personalizing every outcome. He no longer interprets rejection as a verdict on his worth. He sees it as information about where he is, where she is, and whether those paths truly align. This alone creates a quiet strength. A man who does not argue with reality becomes difficult to unsettle. In this stage of life, being single no longer feels like failure. It feels like space. Space to observe without desperation, to choose without pressure, to relate without self-betrayal. And within that space, he begins to understand women not as puzzles to solve, but as emotional beings responding to the energy a man consistently embodies. This is where wisdom begins. Not in knowing how to attract, but in understanding why attraction naturally arises when a man is anchored within himself. As this understanding deepens, the older single man begins to notice something else, something subtle, yet profound. Women do not respond most strongly to a man's words, achievements, or even his intentions. They respond to how he carries himself emotionally over time. Consistency, not intensity, becomes the signal that matters. When he was younger, he may have believed that being emotionally open meant revealing everything quickly, sharing fears early, and offering reassurance constantly. He now sees how this often created imbalance, not because vulnerability is weakness, but because unprocessed vulnerability seeks containment. And when a man looks to a woman to regulate his emotional world, attraction quietly erodes. What once felt like closeness begins to feel like pressure. With age, he understands that emotional self-regulation is one of the most attractive forms of strength. A man who can experience desire without urgency, affection without possession, and uncertainty without anxiety communicates safety without saying a word. This does not mean emotional distance. It means emotional sovereignty. He owns his internal state rather than outsourcing it. He also begins to recognize how women test, not out of cruelty, but out of instinct. Emotional tests are rarely conscious. They appear as changes in tone, temporary withdrawal, or subtle challenges to a man's frame. In his younger years, he may have reacted over-explaining, chasing clarity, or attempting to restore comfort immediately. Now he understands that these moments are not crises. They are moments of observation. A woman watches how a man responds when things are not smooth. Does he remain grounded, or does he become reactive? Does he maintain warmth without self-abandonment, or does he collapse into appeasement? These responses reveal far more than any declaration of intent. Emotional steadiness signals reliability at a nervous system level. An older man also begins to understand that attraction is dynamic. It is not a fixed state achieved once and secured forever. It fluctuates with emotional polarity, respect, and perceived self. He sees how relationships deteriorated not because love vanished, but because polarity slowly flattened. Familiarity replaced curiosity, need replaced presence. This awareness changes how he approaches women. He no longer tries to be everything. He allows space. He allows silence. He allows a woman to move toward him rather than constantly moving toward her. This is not manipulation, it is trust in natural emotional gravity. When two people are aligned, effort feels mutual, not forced. He also becomes less reactive to mixed signals. Where once confusion caused rumination, now it invites assessment. He understands that inconsistency often reflects internal conflict, not intentional harm. And he knows that trying to stabilize someone else's uncertainty only pulls him off balance. Perhaps the most liberating realization is this: women are not searching for perfection, they are responding to emotional clarity. A man who knows who he is, what he values, and how he lives even imperfectly creates a sense of orientation. In a complex emotional world, orientation feels safe, so the older single man slows down. He listens more than he persuades. He observes patterns instead of chasing potential. He allows attraction to reveal itself rather than trying to manufacture it, and in doing so, he becomes less available to chaos, and more available to genuine connection. This is not withdrawal from intimacy, it is maturity within it. Asterisk with this maturity. Another realization settles in, one that can feel sobering at first, but ultimately freeing. The older single man understands that timing matters more than intention. Two people can care deeply for each other and still be emotionally misaligned. Desire does not guarantee readiness, and chemistry does not override inner instability. In earlier years, he may have believed that patience could fix misalignment, that if he stayed consistent, supportive, and understanding, things would eventually settle. Experience teaches him otherwise. Emotional patterns tend to repeat until they are consciously addressed. Waiting inside a dynamic that does not nourish him only delays clarity. He begins to see how many relationships fail not because of a lack of affection, but because of unexamined emotional habits. Avoidance, anxiety, and control often disguise themselves as personality traits. An older man recognizes these patterns sooner, not with judgment, but with discernment. He understands that love cannot stabilize what self-awareness has not yet touched. This leads to a deeper insight about women that youth rarely affords. Attraction often exists alongside fear. A woman may feel drawn to a man and simultaneously resist closeness if intimacy threatens her sense of autonomy or safety. This inner conflict is not resolved by reassurance alone. In fact, excessive reassurance can intensify it. The older single man no longer interprets emotional push and pull as a challenge to overcome. He sees it as information about someone's internal landscape. Instead of asking, "How do I make this work?" he begins asking, "Is this emotionally sustainable?" That question changes everything. He also understands that women are acutely sensitive to ink. When a man's words promise calm but his behavior signals tension, the nervous system notices. When he says he is secure but reacts strongly to uncertainty, the inconsistency creates doubt. Trust is built less on promises and more on predictability of emotional response. This awareness leads him inward. Rather than focusing on how women behave, he studies how he responds. He notices which dynamics activate anxiety, which ones invite peace, and which ones drain his energy over time. This self-observation becomes his compass. He also realizes that loneliness can distort perception. The desire for companionship can tempt a man to rationalize red flags, minimize incompatibility, or accept emotional volatility as passion. With age, he sees how costly this is. Peace, once tasted, becomes difficult to trade away. An older single man begins to value emotional simplicity. Not boredom, but clarity. He notices that the right connection feels grounded, not dizzying. Conversations flow without performance. Silence does not feel threatening. Disagreements do not destabilize his sense of self. These are not dramatic qualities, but they are rare. This does not mean he becomes closed off. On the contrary, he becomes more selective with his openness. He invests where reciprocity exists. He engages where curiosity is mutual. And when it is not, he releases without resentment. Perhaps the most important understanding he gains is this: he is no longer trying to be chosen. He is choosing And this shift from seeking validation to exercising discernment fundamentally changes how women experience him. What once felt like effort now feels like alignment. At this stage, the older single man begins to notice how power quietly operates beneath romance. Not power as domination, but as emotional leverage. Who needs more, who waits, who adapts, and who remains centered. When he was younger, he rarely saw this clearly because desire clouded perception. Now, desire exists, but it no longer blinds him. He understands that imbalance often begins the moment a man abandons his inner rhythm to synchronize entirely with someone else's, when his schedule bends too easily, when his values soften under pressure, when his emotional state becomes dependent on her mood. Polarity slowly erodes. Attraction fades not because love is cruel, but because self-loss is unsettling to witness. This awareness changes how he shows interest. He no longer overinvests early, not out of strategy, but out of respect for natural pacing. He understands that emotional intimacy must be built on shared presence over time, not accelerated through intensity. Rushing creates a false closeness that collapses under weight. He also sees more clearly how women respond to boundaries, not rigid walls, but calm limits. When a man can say no without anger, decline without explanation, and pause without guilt, it communicates self. Boundaries, he learns, are not obstacles to connection. They are filters for it. An older single man also begins to understand that women often mirror a man's relationship with himself. If he tolerates chaos internally, he will attract it externally. If he is at war with his own needs, he will gravitate toward dynamics that reinforce that conflict. This is not punishment, it is resonance. With this insight, he stops blaming women for past outcomes. Blame dissolves into responsibility. Responsibility for who he chose, how long he stayed, and what he ignored. This responsibility is empowering, not heavy. It returns agency to where it belongs. He also notices something unexpected when he becomes less available to dysfunction. Some women lose interest quickly, while others lean in more deeply. This contrast teaches him an essential truth: connection built on emotional volatility requires volatility to survive. Remove the instability, and the bond dissolves. This does not make him cynical. It makes him precise. He understands that intensity can feel like intimacy, but they are not the same. True intimacy feels safe, even when it is passionate. It allows both people to remain themselves without fear of loss. He becomes attentive to how he feels after interactions, not the excitement during them, but the emotional residue afterward. Is there calm or confusion, clarity or rumination, energy or depletion? These sensations become more trustworthy than verbal assurances. Over time, he also recognizes that many women are not consciously seeking power, but safety. Emotional steadiness reads as safety. Predictable self-respect reads as safety. A man who does not need to control outcomes reads as safety. And safety, at a deep level, is attractive. So he stops negotiating his center for affection. He remains warm, present, and open but rooted. And in doing so, he discovers that the most compelling form of confidence is not assertiveness, but inner stillness. This is the kind of power that does not announce itself, yet quietly shapes every interaction. With this inner stillness established, the older single man begins to experience women differently, not as mysteries to decode, but as mirrors reflecting his internal order. He notices that the quality of women he attracts changes as his own emotional environment becomes calmer and more defined. In his earlier years, attraction often carried an undercurrent of urgency, a subtle fear of missing out, a pressure to secure something before it disappeared. Now urgency has been replaced by patience. He understands that what is meant to align does not require pursuit fueled by anxiety. It requires presence and discernment. He also becomes aware of how much projection occurs in early attraction. Both men and women tend to see potential rather than reality. The older single man learns to gently separate what is happening from what he hopes might happen. He listens carefully not just to what a woman says, but to how consistently her actions align with her words over time. This patience allows him to see emotional availability clearly. Interest without availability is no longer confusing. He understands that attraction alone does not build relationships, capacity does. Capacity to communicate, to repair, to stay present during discomfort. Without this, chemistry becomes unstable. He also learns that women are often more comfortable with a man who is emotionally anchored than one who is emotionally impressive. Grand gestures fade quickly. Emotional reliability does not. A man who remains himself across changing circumstances becomes easier to trust. Another insight quietly emerges. Desire flourishes in freedom. When a man does not attempt to manage outcomes, women feel less pressure to perform or reassure. Space allows authenticity, and authenticity, more than effort, sustains attraction. The older single man no longer tries to rescue uncertainty or resolve ambiguity prematurely. He allows things to unfold at a pace that reveals truth. If interest deepens, it does so organically. If it fades, it does so without internal resistance. He also becomes less reactive to beauty, charm, or charisma alone. These qualities still register, but they are no longer decisive. Emotional maturity becomes the differentiator. He notices how some interactions feel stimulating but draining, while others feel simple and nourishing. This discernment extends inward as well. He notices when he is tempted to abandon standards out of loneliness. He notices when desire tries to override wisdom, and instead of suppressing these impulses, he acknowledges them calmly and chooses alignment over impulse. Perhaps the most important realization here is that love is not something to chase, it is something to recognize. Recognition requires clarity, and clarity only arrives when a man is no longer negotiating against himself. This does not make him detached, it makes him intentional. He remains open to connection, but no longer at the cost of his equilibrium, and paradoxically, this makes connection more likely, not less. When a man knows he can walk away without resentment, he interacts without fear. When fear leaves, presence deepens, and presence, more than any tactic or strategy, is what women respond to most. This is the quiet confidence of a man who has learned to stand still and let life come to him. By this stage, the older single man arrives at an understanding that is both humbling and stabilizing. Women are not the source of his fulfillment, but they can be a reflection of it. This distinction changes the emotional posture from which he relates. He no longer looks toward romance to complete his identity or soothe unresolved restlessness. Instead, he approaches connection as an addition to an already structured life. He notices that when his sense of purpose is clear, when his days have direction and his values are lived rather than discussed, interactions with women feel lighter. There is less internal bargaining, less silent hoping. He is not trying to extract meaning from attraction. Meaning already exists elsewhere. This inner grounding alters how women perceive him, not because he is performing indifference, but because he is genuinely occupied with his own trajectory. His attention becomes valuable precisely because it is not constantly available. Presence, when it is chosen rather than compulsive, carries weight. He also understands something subtle about emotional influence. The person who can tolerate uncertainty, without needing immediate resolution, often holds the emotional center. This does not mean withholding affection or clarity. It means allowing emotions to move naturally without forcing premature conclusions. Calm patience becomes a form of leadership. An older single man recognizes that many relational conflicts are not about the issue being discussed, but about emotional regulation. When one person escalates and the other stabilizes, the dynamic changes. He learns to be the stabilizing presence, not to control the outcome, but to maintain internal coherence. He also becomes aware of how silence functions. Silence is no longer something to fill anxiously. It becomes a space where truth emerges. In silence, interest either moves closer or drifts away. Both outcomes provide clarity, neither needs to be resisted. This maturity also changes how he experiences rejection. Rejection no longer feels like exclusion from something essential. It feels like redirection. He understands that being incompatible with someone's emotional needs does not diminish his value. It simply reveals misalignment. He stops confusing being wanted with being chosen well. Attention loses its intoxicating pull. What matters now is mutual investment, shared emotional tempo, and respect for each other's autonomy. Anything less feels noisy. At this stage, women who are accustomed to emotional turbulence may find him unfamiliar. His steadiness can feel grounding or unexciting depending on where they are in their own development. He accepts both responses without internal conflict. This acceptance is key. He is no longer trying to be universally appealing. He is congruent. And congruence, while it narrows the field, deepens the quality of connection. What he ultimately understands is this: intimacy is not created by intensity, persuasion, or sacrifice. It is created by two people who are regulated enough to meet without distortion. And he knows now that if such a meeting happens, it will not need to be forced eventually. The older single man reaches a conclusion that feels less like a lesson and more like a quiet truth he can no longer unsee. Understanding women was never the final goal. Understanding himself was. Women simply revealed where that understanding was incomplete. He sees now that every relationship served as feedback, not verdicts of success or failure, but mirrors reflecting his emotional posture at the time. Where he abandoned himself, attraction faded. Where he stayed centered, connection either stabilized or ended cleanly. Both outcomes carried dignity. This realization removes resentment from the past. He no longer rewrites old stories with blame or regret. He integrates them. Experience becomes wisdom only when it is metabolized without bitterness. And bitterness, he knows, is the fastest way to lose emotional authority. He also understands that love, at its healthiest, is calm, not dull, but grounded. It does not require vigilance, it does not demand performance. It allows two individuals to remain whole rather than fused. This kind of intimacy feels almost unfamiliar to those conditioned by chaos, but it is deeply sustaining. The older single man no longer fears being alone. Solitude has taught him discernment, patience, and emotional independence. Being single is not an identity, it is a season. And like all seasons, it has a function. It strips away illusions and clarifies what truly matters. He understands now that women are not seeking a man who never feels doubt or desire. They are responding to a man who does not let doubt govern him, and does not let desire dissolve his boundaries. Emotional resilience, once developed, becomes quiet leadership. This is why he moves differently. He listens without trying to fix. He speaks without trying to convince. He commits without losing himself. And if commitment does not arise, he releases without collapse. There is no resentment in this stance, only respect for himself, and for the emotional complexity of others. He no longer tries to be understood by everyone. He understands himself well enough to choose where to invest. In the end, what he understands about women is simple, but not easy. They respond to who a man is being, not who he is trying to become for them. Presence outweighs potential. Stability outweighs intensity. Self-mastery outweighs persuasion. This is not a strategy. It is a way of living. And so he continues curious, grounded, and self-directed, open to connection, but no longer defined by it. If love arrives, it will meet him where he stands, not where he is chasing. If you find these reflections resonating, consider staying with this space. Subscribe for calm, psychologically grounded explorations of human nature, relationships, and self-mastery. Not for answers, but for clearer questions.